All right, so today we're diving into the fascinating world of geisha.
A world that I think a lot of people, especially in the West, have uh, a lot of, shall we say, preconceived notions
Oh,
about.
yeah, absolutely.
And we're going to be drawing from a lot of great material today, primarily the Wikipedia article on geisha, to really sort of unpack it all.
Yeah, it's a really deep, really thorough piece of writing. I mean, we could spend weeks on this and still not cover everything, but
Right, right.
we're going to try to hit all the main points, I think. Really kind of give people a more complete picture what this world is really all about.
Exactly. It's so much more than just the sort of surface level understanding that a lot of folks have.
Yeah. So why don't we start with, kind of the basics, just to get the terminology straight, because even that can be a bit confusing, right?
Absolutely. So, we're talking about geisha, but you also have terms like Geico and Geiji, Hanamachi, Kurikai.
Meiko, Minarai.
Yeah, all these different terms.
Mm.
So it helps to kind of define those. Oh.
So how about we start with geisha, Geico, Geigi? What are the distinctions there?
Well, they all essentially refer to the same profession, but there are some regional nuances.
Okay.
For instance, in Kyoto and also in Kanazawa, they use the term Geiko, which literally means woman of art.
That's pretty straightforward.
Yeah, it is.
Yeah, I like that.
And Geigi is another regional variation. You hear that in some areas as well. But geisha itself, if you break it down, it's gei, meaning art, and sha, meaning person. So it literally translates to art person or performing artist.
So it's right there in the name, really.
It is, yeah. It gives you the core of what this profession is all about.
And then there are terms for the places where they live and work, Hanamachi, Karikai. What are those all about?
Right. So Hanamachi literally means flower town. And that refers to the specific geisha district, the area where they're based,
Okay.
where they work, often where they live as well.
Gotcha.
Karika is a little broader. It translates to flower and willow world. And historically, it encompassed both geisha and courtesans. So it was a more encompassing term for that whole world of entertainment and,
Pleasure quarters, I guess.
exactly. And the courtesans, they were seen as the flowers.
Right.
More showy, more ostentatious, whereas the geisha were the willows, more subtle, more understated.
Ah, okay. So it's like two different approaches to, I guess, a similar goal.
Yes, exactly.
And nowadays, Karikai, does that still encompass both or?
It's more associated with the geisha world now.
Okay, got
The
it.
courtesans as a distinct profession no longer really exist.
Right.
Yeah.
Okay. And then there are all the different terms for the apprentices, the training stages, shikomi, minarai, maiko. What do those all mean?
Yeah, so this is where you see the really structured progression within this world. Shikomi is the first stage. It's essentially the trainee stage.
Okay.
And during this time, young women are living in the okiya, which is the geisha lodging house.
Gotcha.
And they're learning the foundational skills, everything from house duties to, just the basic traditions of the karikai.
Like the etiquette and all that.
Exactly, exactly. Then after shikomi comes minarai. Minarai means learning by observation.
That makes sense.
And this is a shorter stage where they start attending ozashiki, which are the geisha parties.
Okay.
And they're observing the senior performers, really absorbing everything, but not actively participating yet.
Soaking it all in.
Yeah, exactly.
That's cool.
And then finally you have maiko. And that's probably the term most people recognize. It
Yeah.
means woman of dance, and it's a much longer stage lasting several years where they're really honing their skills before they make their full debut as a geisha.
So before we get into all the details of that training process, I think it'd be good to step back and look at, the historical roots of all this. Where does it all come from?
Right. So it actually goes pretty far back. One of the earliest kind of predecessors to the geisha were the saburuko. And these were essentially serving girls,
Okay.
many of whom had been displaced by war or other circumstances.
That makes sense.
And their roles were pretty diverse. Some did offer sexual services, but others were more focused on entertaining at social gatherings through song and dance.
So kind of a broader category than we might think of today.
Yeah, it wasn't as clearly defined.
Right.
And then you have the influence of the Han period, which is known for its flourishing arts and culture.
Yeah, starting in 794, right, when the capital moved to Kyoto.
Exactly. And during this period, you see a real blossoming of traditional Japanese art forms. And skilled female performers started appearing at the imperial court.
Like the Shirabushi dancers, right?
Precisely. They were known for their elegant dances, and they really established a tradition of female performance that would later influence both the geisha and kabuki theater.
So a lot of those early traditions were really kind of laying the groundwork for what would come later.
Absolutely. And then you have the emergence of the courtesans, the yujo, the oiran. They were a really significant part of this whole story.
So these are the women working in the pleasure quarters.
Exactly. And these quarters, known as yukaku, were formally established in the 16th century. Within those districts, you had the yujo, which means women of pleasure,
Okay.
and they were formally classified. The highest rank were the oiran, and even above them, the taiyu,
So a whole hierarchy there.
a very clear hierarchy.
And they were primarily focused on, I guess, prostitution.
Yes, that was their primary role. But the higher ranks, particularly the oiran, they also incorporated traditional arts into their entertainment.
Okay.
They were the celebrities of their time.
Right, like the A-listers.
Exactly. They were known for their poetry, their calligraphy, they sang Nagata ballads, they played instruments like the kokyu and the koto.
Wow, so they were really accomplished.
They were.
Yeah.
So they were definitely artistic figures, but within a different primary role.
Right, it wasn't the primary focus.
Right.
And around the same time, we also see the beginnings of kabuki theater.
Right. Exactly. Kabuki emerges around the same time, originating from performers like Izumura Bakuni. So you have all these different forms of female artistry developing alongside each other.
Okay, so now we have this backdrop of, skilled female performers, established pleasure quarters. How do the geisha, as we kind of understand them specifically, fit into this? How did they actually emerge in the 18th century?
Right. Well, you see the pleasure quarters, beyond just being places for sexual encounters, they start to evolve into these broader entertainment hubs.
Okay.
You have these highly skilled courtesans who are already providing dance, song, music for their clients.
Right.
And around the turn of the 18th century, you start to see the kind of predecessors to the geisha emerge.
Like, what kind of performers are we talking about here?
Well, some of the earliest were actually male geisha.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah, they're known as taikomochi or hushkan, and they would basically act as party facilitators, keeping things lively, keeping the sake flowing.
Kind of like hype men, almost?
Yeah, you could think of it that way.
That's cool.
And then there were also the odoriko, which means dancing girls, teenage girls who were hired to perform in the tea houses.
Okay, and were they also engaging in prostitution, or are they kind of seen as more
It seems they were presented as more chaste.
Okay.
So the lines were definitely starting to get a little blurry there.
Right.
And it's also interesting to note that by the 1680s, these odoriko had become so popular that they were even performing in the homes of upper-class samurai.
So they're breaking out of the pleasure quarters a little bit.
They are, yeah.
Yeah.
And it seems that some courtesans, as their contracts ended or as they got a little older, they chose to stay within these districts.
Okay.
And they would use their existing skills, their artistic skills, to provide entertainment.
Interesting.
So by the early 18th century, you start to see this term gaiko being used.
But that was a little confusing, right?
It was, yeah. Because in some areas, it actually became associated with illegal prostitution.
So a different meaning than how we understand it today.
Exactly. It was kind of a transitional term, you could say.
That's fascinating. So when did we get the first, official geisha as we would recognize it today?
Well, that's a great question. And the Wikipedia article actually points to a woman named Kikuya in Fukagawa around 1750.
Okay.
She previously worked as a prostitute, but she became incredibly skilled as a singer and a shamisen player.
Okay.
And she basically made this bold move to declare herself a geisha.
Like she actually used that term.
She did. She said, "I am a geisha," and explicitly focused on her artistic talents. It was quite revolutionary.
Wow, she was a trailblazer.
She was, and she became hugely popular, really establishing this idea of a female geisha as an artist.
So it's like she redefined the whole thing.
In a way, yeah. And
That-
after her success, more women started to follow suit. They saw the potential for a career, emphasizing their music, their dance, their poetry.
So it was like a real turning point.
It was, yeah.
That's so cool. So by the turn of the 19th century, how had things changed? What was the status of geisha at that point?
Well, by 1800, the profession was pretty much understood to be almost entirely female.
Okay.
They had really established themselves as a distinct role.
Right. Separate from the courtesans.
Exactly. But they were still very much associated with the pleasure quarters.
Okay.
And as they gained more independence and their popularity grew, regulations were introduced.
What kind of regulations are we talking about?
Well, some of them were actually meant to protect the courtesans' businesses.
Interesting.
because they were facing increasing competition.
Right, because now you have these geisha who are offering a similar kind of entertainment.
Exactly. And so geisha were officially forbidden from selling sex.
But was that always enforced?
Not necessarily, no,
Okay.
but it was on the books.
Right.
And they were also restricted from wearing the very elaborate hairstyles and kimono that were associated with the courtesans.
It's like they're trying to visually differentiate them.
Exactly. To create a clear distinction in the eyes of the law and the public.
So you can't, you can't mistake one for the other. Interesting. And I guess on top of that, there was probably some rivalry between the two groups, right?
No, absolutely.
Yeah.
The courtesans were the established elite.
Yeah.
And the geisha were the up-and-comers.
New kids on the block.
Exactly.
So how did that rivalry or that tension play out?
Well, it's interesting. Despite officially being considered lower-class entertainers,
Yeah.
geisha became incredibly popular, especially among the merchant class.
Okay.
Because these wealthy merchants, they had money, but they often lacked access to the top-ranking courtesans.
Well, we're catering to the nobility, right?
Exactly. So the geisha kind of filled this gap.
That makes sense.
And at the same time, the status of the courtesans as the ultimate fashion icons started to decline a little.
Really? Why is that?
Well, I think their art forms were seen by some as a bit old-fashioned,
Okay.
tied to a fading era. And their appearance, which was so elaborate, started to be seen as almost gaudy compared to the more refined aesthetic that was developing around the geisha.
So the geisha were like the new trendsetters.
Yeah. They were seen as more modern, more attuned to the evolving taste.
More cutting edge.
Exactly. And they were referred to as machi geisha, meaning town geisha, to distinguish them from those still working more directly within the pleasure quarters.
Okay.
And it's funny because some of the laws that were intended to kind of control the lower classes.
Like sumptuary laws.
Exactly. They actually ended up furthering the popularity of geisha.
How so?
Well, because those laws restricted how much people could spend on clothing and accessories.
Okay.
And so the geisha, with their more understated elegance, they kind of became the epitome of style.
It's like they turn those restrictions into an advantage.
They did, yeah. By the 1830s, they were widely considered the premier fashion icons.
Wow, that's amazing. And I guess all this also led to different classifications of geisha emerging.
Right. You had Kurua geisha, who did engage in sexual relations with customers. And then you had Yujo, or Jor geisha, where sex was a primary part of their service. And then you had Machi geisha, who officially did not offer sexual services.
Okay, so even within the geisha world, there was this distinction.
Yes, absolutely.
Gotcha. So moving ahead a bit, what about the 20th century? What were some of the big developments there?
Well, a major turning point was the criminalization of prostitution in Japan in 1956.
Okay.
Because that really solidified the geisha's role as primarily artistic entertainers.
Right.
And it's interesting, the Wikipedia article mentions the impact of the COVID-19 pandemic.
Oh, yeah. How did that affect them?
Well, it led to the launch of this Meet Geisha project, which was a direct response to the huge loss of income they suffered during the pandemic.
Yeah, because everything shut down.
Exactly. And so this project was initially about bringing tourists back.
Okay.
But it also involved expanding their online presence.
So kind of adapting to the times.
Yeah. And, it's interesting to think about how geisha have been portrayed in popular culture.
Oh, yeah, there's a lot to unpack there.
There is, yeah. From memoirs of a geisha to video games like Ghost of Tsushima.
Even Roblox, apparently.
Even Roblox, yeah.
Yeah.
It's kind of fascinating to see this centuries-old tradition interacting with these modern platforms.
It's like they're finding new ways to reach people.
Absolutely.
And to kind of keep the tradition alive.
Yeah, definitely.
So going back a bit further, what about the pre-war and wartime periods? How did those events impact the geisha world?
Well, before World War II, geisha were actually quite numerous.
Okay.
There were around 80,000 across Japan.
Wow, that's a lot more than I would have guessed.
Yeah, but they were facing increasing competition from the joki, who were essentially the forerunners of modern bar hostesses.
Okay, so that was already starting to change the landscape.
It was. And then with the war, everything changed. Geisha districts were closed down in 1944.
Wow.
And most geisha were conscripted into various forms of war work.
Like what kind of work?
Factory work or other support roles.
So they had to kind of put their traditional roles aside.
They did. And after the war, many did return to the karikai, but some chose to stay in the jobs they had taken during the war.
For stability, I guess.
Exactly. And unfortunately, the term geisha itself suffered a bit during the post-war occupation.
How so?
Well, some of the prostitutes who were catering to American soldiers started calling themselves geisha girls.
Oh, no.
Yeah, and that really created a lasting and inaccurate impression in the West.
That's so unfortunate because it's like it completely misrepresents what they're actually about.
It does, yeah, and
Ugh.
reduces them to something they're not.
Right.
Yeah.
Okay, so moving into the post-war era, how did things start to recover?
Well, in 1945, the tea houses and okiya began to reopen.
Okay.
And a lot of geisha did return, which is interesting because it shows that it was still seen as a viable profession,
Right.
but there was a noticeable shift in the retirement age.
Oh, really?
Yeah. Before the war, many geisha would retire in their mid-20s,
Okay.
often after finding a wealthy patron or getting married.
But after the war.
It became more common to work for longer.
So they were staying in the profession for more of their lives.
They were, yeah. And the perception of geisha also changed a bit.
How so?
Well, before the war, there'd been some discussion about, maybe adopting more Western styles.
Okay.
But after the war, there was this real resurgence of interest in traditional Japanese arts and culture.
Like a return to the roots.
Exactly. And geisha were seen as the protectors of those traditions.
So their role kind of evolved.
It did, yeah.
And then you mentioned the Prostitution Prevention Law of 1956. What was the impact of that?
Well, it criminalized many forms of prostitution, including practices like miswage, which we'll talk about later.
Okay.
And so it really had a profound impact on how the geisha profession was perceived and regulated.
Right.
And it's also worth noting that around this time, the rise of bar hostesses started to kind of overshadow the geisha world a little bit
I can see that.
because it was a more casual, more accessible form of entertainment.
Right. And probably less expensive.
Yeah, definitely. And then in the 1960s, compulsory education laws meant that young women were staying in school longer, which led to a decline in the number of young maiko entering the profession.
So they had to find new ways to recruit.
Exactly.
And so by the 1970s, were there signs of decline?
Yeah, you start to see this aging of the geisha population.
Okay.
And by 1989, official reports indicated a decline in overall numbers.
So bringing us to the present day, what does life look like for a geisha in modern Japan?
Well, they still primarily affiliate with okiya, especially during their apprenticeship.
Okay.
But more experienced geisha, particularly in cities like Tokyo, may choose to live independently.
So there's a little more freedom now.
There is, yeah. And they're typically hired to entertain at parties held in tea houses or high-end Japanese restaurants known as riste.
And how does the whole, payment structure work these days?
Well, the traditional system, which is based on the burning time of incense sticks,
Senkudai.
yeah, or a general fee called gyokudai,
Okay.
that's largely been replaced with hourly rates.
Which I guess makes sense because it's more transparent.
It is, yeah.
And how are appointments arranged?
They're generally managed by the okasan, the mother of the okiya,
Okay.
often through the kenban, which is kind of like the official registry office for the hanamachi.
So it's still very much a structured system.
It is, yeah.
So is it rare to see a geisha or maiko out in public these days?
It is, yeah. Outside of the hanamachi districts, it's pretty uncommon.
Especially in their full attire, I imagine.
Exactly. And, what you often see in tourist areas like Kyoto are tourists doing henshin.
Which is like the dress-up experience.
Exactly.
Right.
And sadly, the actual number of geisha continues to decline.
That's a shame.
It is. It's due to a lot of factors, economic trends,
Yeah.
declining interest among younger generations.
I guess it's a very demanding lifestyle.
It is, yeah. And it's very expensive to be a client.
Right.
So there are a lot of barriers to entry, so to speak.
Yeah, I can see that.
But the internet has actually opened up some new avenues for recruitment.
Oh, interesting.
And there have been some inspiring documentaries that have drawn some attention.
So there's hope.
There is, yeah. But, there's also the issue of tourist harassment.
Oh, right. I've heard about that.
Yeah, it's
Right.
become a real problem in Kyoto, and it's led to the implementation of preventative patrols.
Wow. That's unfortunate that it's come to that.
It is, yeah.
Okay, well, let's shift gears a bit and talk about their appearance because it's so iconic, and I think a lot of people are drawn to the visual aspect of it.
Right. And it's more than just aesthetics,
Mhm.
It's all very symbolic. The
Yeah.
way they dress, their makeup, their hairstyles, it all reflects their training, their seniority, their status within the Kaiukai.
So can you break down some of the key differences between, say, a maiko and a geisha in terms of their appearance?
Yeah, absolutely. So a Maiko, she has this very formal and consistent style,
Okay.
The long-sleeved kimono, the elaborate obi, the full white oshiroi makeup, and they use their own hair for their hairstyles, adorned with all the kanzashi.
The hair ornaments?
Exactly.
Wow.
A geisha, as she matures, her appearance becomes more subdued, more sophisticated. Her kimono have shorter sleeves. She has more flexibility in her choices.
Right.
Her makeup is less intense, and she often wears wigs.
For convenience, I imagine.
Yeah, and also to achieve those specific hairstyles.
And speaking of makeup, what about the Oshiroi, the white foundation? Are there differences in how Maiko and Geisha apply that?
Yeah, so they both use it, but there are definitely variations.
Okay.
For example, a first-year Maiko, she'll typically only paint her lower lip red.
Really?
Yeah, while older Maiko and geisha will paint both.
Interesting.
And younger Maiko also tend to use less black makeup around the eyes.
To look more youthful, I guess.
Exactly. Their eyebrows might be shorter and rounder, and they wear more blush than geisha.
Okay.
And as a geisha ages, she tends to use more black around her eyes for definition.
Right.
And she may reserve the full white makeup only for formal occasions.
Makes sense.
Yeah. And it's also interesting to note that in some Kyoto districts, Maiko will blacken their teeth.
Oh, the Owoguro.
Yes, the ohaguro. But only for a short time before their erikai, which is their graduation ceremony.
It's like a final stage of their apprenticeship.
Right.
And what about the kimono? The haikizuri, right? Are there distinctions there as well?
Yeah, so both Maiko and geisha wear haikizuri, which are those trailing skirt kimono.
Okay.
But the Maiko ones have these furisode-style sleeves, which are very long and have deep tucks.
And those tucks were historically let out as the Maiko grew, right?
Exactly. It was all about accommodating their growth.
Wow, that's so clever.
And their kimono are also much more colorful and decorated than a geisha's,
Okay.
often featuring elaborate designs, not just on the outside, but on the inside hem as well.
Really?
Yeah, and unlike geisha, who typically own their own kimono, Maiko often borrow them from their okiya.
Because they're so expensive, I imagine.
They are, yeah.
And the obi, the sashes, those are pretty distinctive too, right?
Yes, definitely. Maiko in Kyoto, they wear this very long dorari obi.
It's like trailing down their back.
Exactly. It's tied in a very specific way to show off its length and the intricate patterns.
It's beautiful.
It is. And then their footwear is different too. Maiko wear those raised platform sandals,
Yeah.
the zuri or the okobo,
Okay.
while geisha usually wear flatter getter or zuri.
Gotcha. And then there are the hairstyles, the shimada, right?
Yes, the shimada. It's the fundamental hairstyle for both geisha and Maiko.
Okay.
But after World War II, geisha started wearing wigs for convenience,
Okay.
while Maiko continued to style their own hair.
Wow. And there are all those different variations of the shimada, right?
There are, yeah. For Maiko, there are 5 distinct traditional hairstyles, each marking a different stage of their apprenticeship.
So it's like a visual marker of their progress.
Exactly.
That's so cool.
And then modern geisha most commonly wear this sleeker version called the Chutaka Shimada.
Okay.
And older geisha might wear the flatter Tsubushi Taka Shimada for formal occasions.
And then there are the hair ornaments, the kanzashi.
Yes, the kanzashi. Maiko wear a lot more of them than geisha. And even the specific style and number can indicate their stage of training.
So it's all very deliberate, very meaningful.
It is, yeah.
So we've talked about their appearance, but what about their actual performances? Because it's not just about, looking beautiful and engaging in conversation, right?
Right. Geisha are highly skilled artists, and they undergo years of training in music and dance.
So what are some of the key art forms that they're trained in?
Well, dance is a major one, and their style of dance evolved from earlier forms like nu and kabuki,
Okay.
but it's become more subtle, more stylized.
More nuanced, I guess.
Exactly. It's about conveying emotions and stories through these really precise gestures and movements.
That's beautiful.
And then music is another major component. The shamisen is their primary instrument.
The shamisen, that's the 3-stringed instrument.
Yes, it's kind of like a banjo
right.
with a very distinctive sound, often quite melancholic.
Yeah, I love the sound of the shamisen.
It's beautiful. And during their apprenticeship, all Maiko have to learn to play it, as well as other instruments like the kotsuzumi, which is a small hand drum,
Okay.
and the fu flute.
So it's a pretty comprehensive musical education.
It is, yeah.
And then once they become geisha, can they choose to specialize?
Yes, they can. They can become jikata, who are primarily musicians,
Okay.
or tachikata, who are primarily dancers.
So they can really kind of focus on their strengths.
Exactly.
And beyond music and dance, are there other art forms that they pursue?
Some do, yeah. Poetry, painting, calligraphy. Some even compose music.
Wow, so it's really a life dedicated to the arts.
It is, yeah.
So for people who are interested in seeing geisha perform, are there opportunities to do that?
There are, yeah.
Hmm.
Traditionally, their world was pretty private,
Okay.
but there's been an increase in public performances in recent years.
Like what kind of events?
Well, the most common are the annual public dances known as Odori,
Okay.
and these are held by all 5 of the Kyoto Hanamachi and some of the Tokyo districts as well.
So it's a chance for people to really experience that traditional dance.
It is, yeah. And the tickets are usually pretty affordable.
That's good.
And then there's this really cool event at the Kitano Tenman-gu Shrine in Kyoto.
Oh, I've heard of that.
Yeah. It's an open-air tea ceremony during the Plum Blossom Festival.
The no date.
Yes, the no date.
Where the geisha and Maiko serve tea.
Exactly.
That's so elegant.
It is. And then in the summer, some Hanamachi even organize geisha beer gardens.
Really?
Yeah. It's a more casual setting, but you can still enjoy their performances.
That's awesome.
Yeah. So they're definitely finding ways to kind of bridge the gap between tradition and modernity.
Right, to kind of make it more accessible.
Exactly.
So let's dive into the training process itself. It's clearly very intense, very rigorous. What are the different stages?
Well, it's a long road. In the past, training would often start at a very young age.
Like 6 years old, I've heard.
Yeah. But these days, the typical age for a Maiko debut is 17 or 18.
Okay, so more in line with finishing high school.
Exactly. And in some areas, labor laws set a minimum age of 18.
To protect young people.
Right. But Kyoto has some exceptions to allow.